At 7:30 a.m. Rome time on Monday, the 21st of April, just a day after Easter, the Vatican announced the passing of Pope Francis. The cause of his death, of course, heart failure brought about by a stroke. And as we and the entire world mourn his passing, we pray for the repose of his soul. And tonight, we'll take a look at that 12-year pontificate and analyze Pope Francis's legacy with the Papal Posse. Editor-in-Chief of the CatholicThing.org, Robert Royal, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray. Can you believe, gentlemen, that it's been 12 years since we were in Rome covering the conclave that elected Jorge Bergoglio, the 266th Pope of the Roman Catholic Church? So it's fitting that we once again come together, first to mourn him and then to watch and report on this incredible event that will happen in Rome. A lot happening at this moment in Rome. Pope Francis's death was certified by the Camerlengo this week. That's the papal chamberlain, the administrator, if you will, Cardinal Kevin Farrell. The papal apartment was sealed, the fisherman's ring broken, and the general congregation meetings of the College of Cardinals are already underway. There have been several days of those, and that's basically to plan the papal funeral scheduled for Saturday, April 26th, and the adjacent events leading into the start of the conclave. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. And before I begin, I want to share the words of retired Archbishop Charles Chaput about the passing of Pope Francis this week and get your reaction. This certainly struck me. He said this: "I have personal memories of Pope Francis that I greatly value. He devoted himself to serving the Church and her people in ways that he felt the times demanded. As a brother in the faith and a successor of Peter, he deserves our ongoing prayers and for his eternal life in the presence of the God he loved." Having said that, an interregnum between papacies is a time for candor. The lack of it, given today's challenges, is too expensive. In many ways, whatever its strengths, the Francis pontificate was inadequate to the real issues facing the Church. Those are the words of Archbishop Emeritus Charles Chaput, formerly of Philadelphia. When I read that, I thought, these should be our watchwords on the world over: a time for candor. So on this episode, I want to honor Pope Francis's legacy. I want to talk candidly about where we are because of it. And let's go back first, gents, to when we covered the interregnum and the conclave and we saw Jorge Bergoglio become Pope Francis. I remember being in St. Peter's Square on CNN when the news first broke, and he first emerged from that balcony.
Fratelli e sorelle, buonasera.
Bob, Father, let's first consider the public face of Pope Francis. The media is filled with stories about how humble he was, his simplicity. Tell me about the public image, and then we'll get into the record. He was the first Jesuit, first Latin American Pope. Father, handicap the image the public absorbed, really right up until the decision to be buried at St. Mary Major and just have his name there, no other papal designation or coat of arms or anything. I'll let you start.
Yes, no, I mean, we mourn the loss of Pope Francis, and certainly if you reflect about his pontificate, he really was kind of breaking the mold and trying to disassociate himself from the historical manifestations of the pontifical authority. So he did not want to live in the apostolic palace. He instead lived in the St. Martha house, which is essentially a hotel that John Paul II built for the cardinals when they would have to convene in the Sistine Chapel. He refused to use some of the more elaborate rituals and vestments of the pontificate. He did want to create an image of simplicity, which I think was in line with his style as Archbishop of Buenos Aires. And that's perfectly fine. Each pope has his own personality. But you do that at the risk of kind of minimizing the office itself in its public manifestations. In other words, people look up to their father and they respect in the way you speak to your father and the way you treat him, the honors that you give him. So a lot of these things were honorifics given to him in order to highlight the fact that his authority comes from God and that we obey him not because he's a person of a specific origin, but because he is the successor of St. Peter.
Bob, you'll remember Pope Francis paying the bill at his hotel after being elected. We have footage of that. His great devotion to mercy, carried his own bags, which became a fixture of any visit. Almost immediately, he shunned many of those traditional trappings. As Father said, the red cope and even the white pants the Pope traditionally wore. Pope Francis wore the black pants. You know, I always thought that was kind of a callback to his Jesuit origins. And the world loved this. How did Catholics receive it?
Well, I think that there was a kind of a threefold response to this. Yes, on the one hand, a lot of people liked the fact that he was a simpler, um, kind of unusual figure from someplace that very few people were familiar with, Argentina. But I think that that mostly was the case for people who don't pay a lot of attention to the Catholic Church. They got the impression of a smiling, genial, very charismatic figure. And he was able to convey that, I think, throughout his papacy, in spite of all the controversies, et cetera, that arose afterwards. But I think what began to divide people is that if we want to put it this way, the more progressive element in the church liked this because they thought other things were coming. I think the people who were more traditional looked at what he was doing and were fearful that this was a kind of a precursor of some changes in the church. And I think Father is exactly right that that uncertainty about the way that he embraced the traditions reflects something that is a particular problem in the modern world. And I agree with Archbishop Chaput that it failed to address the real challenges of the church in the world right now, because it seemed like he was worried about presenting the church as simply exerting power, when in fact what the church really needs to do is recover authority. There's a lot of discussion in the secular world, for example, about, is there authority still in democratic institutions or just political institutions in general, or cultural institutions? And while on the one hand, it was a strong thing for him to do to try to present a different type of papacy, which of course he had any right to do, and he was the one who was going to have to carry out this program, and he had to feel comfortable with it. But there's something different between Jorge Bergoglio, the man, and Pope Francis, the Pope.
And I want to pick up on a point you just mentioned there. Francis quickly began to establish, as you mentioned, Bob, the signature causes early in his pontificate that he would sort of carry the torch on. In July of 2013, he made his first apostolic visit to the Mediterranean island of Lampedusa, long considered a gateway for migrants on their way to Europe. Migration became one of the hallmarks of this papacy, right up until the condemnation of the second Trump administration's deportation of criminal aliens. Father, your thoughts on how issues like this, and perhaps climate change, dominated the papacy?
Yeah, the public face of the papacy included a heavy emphasis on issues of societal arrangements. We could say political decisions. Who gets to emigrate? Who gets the refugee status? Who gets into the country? The whole emphasis about climate change. The Holy See basically was saying all the science leads to the conclusion that man-caused climate change is happening. We got to change that. There were all kinds of issues regarding social engineering, regarding the economy. The Pope essentially leaned toward a more socialistic, controlled economy. He criticized capitalism. The Pope, unfortunately, from my point of view, neglected to speak about doctrinal and spiritual issues that are so important for modern man who has a crisis of faith, and spoke about political issues at great length. Now, he did say things about prayer and doctrine, but those aren't the ones that got the headlines and that kind of entered the consciousness of the faithful.
Yeah, and Bob, look, he was very pro-life. He was unwavering in his pro-life stance. He sort of ping-ponged on marriage. On one hand, he'd be defending it, then the other hand, he'd pass a papal document, which we'll talk about in a second. But in September of 2015, Pope Francis made an historic apostolic visit to Cuba, then to the United States, eventually New York, Washington, Philadelphia. We covered that visit in each of those cities. He became the first pope in history to address the joint session of Congress, and his visit was very well received at the time. Bob, your lasting memory of that visit, and what impression did Pope Francis leave on America at that time?
Yeah, I think that some of the issues we were just talking about were already in play at that moment. And he looked like, as many people have said since, that he was bringing the church into the 21st century. I think that actually that was a misreading, because if we look at to take the issue of immigration that you just brought up, every country in Europe and North America now realizes that more open-handed approach to immigration is an impossibility. What struck me, and maybe the two of you remember this as well, is when he did his final mass at the World Meeting of Families in Philadelphia, which is supposed to be a celebration of marriage and family. And the reading of the day was, I believe, the passage where Christ counsels against divorce and remarriage, that he kind of cut that short and almost gave a homily that seemed to contradict it. So the sense of urgency that he had and the impression that he gave was that these other issues were things that he was going to press within the church and outside. And even though, yes, he was very, very strong about abortion, he talked abortion is like hiring a hitman, there was no sense of urgency. And the papacy, certainly in the way it handled itself institutionally, didn't seek to advance that issue anywhere nearly as much.
Yeah, but Bob, in 2016, as Pope Francis was settling into his papacy, we saw the release of that controversial apostolic exhortation, it's called, papal document of teaching, Amoris Laetitia. And there was that infamous footnote 351, which seemed to open the door to divorced and remarried Catholics without annulments to receive communion. But this was predicated, and Father Jerry, I want you to speak to this. This was predicated by the Synod on the Family that he called, where Cardinal Walter Casper proposed a very similar possibility that divorced and remarried Catholics could just go to communion. Father, tell us what happened with Amoris Laetitia and how that could impact the conclave.
Yes, Amoris Laetitia in that footnote said that in certain cases, people who are divorced and remarried could receive Holy Communion without an annulment. And people were shocked about it because John Paul II and Benedict said the exact opposite, as had all Christian moral history before that. There is no endorsement for people in an adulterous second relationship to be receiving Holy Communion. The Pope issued it in the footnote. Some people said he really wasn't giving them permission. Well, the bishops of Buenos Aires issued a document saying that that's what it meant, communion for divorced and remarried. Mm-hmm. And the Pope put that document into the official register in the Vatican. So he made that quite clear where he stood. This is one of the main issues, along with the blessing of same-sex couples, that will need to be reversed by the next Pope, because it's creating moral confusion and doctrinal chaos in the Church. If you say that the Lord's words, what God has joined, man must not divide, means that if you take up a second wife or husband, you're committing adultery. That's what the Lord's words mean. If you say, well, it doesn't matter, people in adulterous relationships are qualified to receive communion, you've overthrown Catholic moral theology, and you've created doubt about, exactly what does the Church teach. Same about blessing same-sex couples. You cannot say that two people who enter into a sexual relationship in the same sex, that they deserve and are able to be blessed because of what they call their love for each other. No, they're committing sin with each other. We don't bless that kind of relationship.
Yeah, and that document was Fiducia Supplicans, which he didn't pass really until 2023. So that was just a few years ago. But Bob, Cardinal Casper, at the time, I remember, he said that Pope Francis was practicing a theology of the people, that he had instituted a revolution of mercy and love, and these elements we've just been discussing, they would be a part of that. Obviously, other cardinals suggested that he was distorting established church teaching. Your thoughts here, and where does it leave the legacy as well as the man who will follow him?
Yeah, I think that it will inevitably be clear that there was an overemphasis on mercy and reception, an underemphasis on truth and fidelity that this papacy has left us. And I agree with Father that those things in particular are going to have to be reversed. Look, I mentioned the homily at that Philadelphia meeting. For me, one of the things that stands out about this papacy is when the Holy Father decided that the Our Father could not read that when Jesus taught his apostles, lead us not into temptation. He changed the wording of that. And in France and in Italy now, they pray. We don't in English, we haven't changed our translation. But any classical scholar or biblicist would have warned him not to call for that change, because the Lord's words were what the Lord's words were. And the impression that I think all this adds up to, these changes that contradict things that have been taught forever, is that even Jesus's own words have to be corrected with a supplement of mercy. I mean, that simply can't be in the church. We have to remain faithful to what God himself has revealed. And we have to say God knows how to reveal what he wants for the human race.
Yeah, and there was also the change in the catechism on the death penalty as well, which we don't have time to get into, but we will in the coming days. Another major feature, and God knows we cover this almost week in and week out, of the Francis Pontificate, is that infamous secret Vatican China Agreement, which allowed the CCP to have input in the appointment of Catholic bishops. And it also allows the distortion, I would say the perversion of the gospel in Catholic worship in China, where you're inserting Mao and Xi into the gospel narratives, into the readings. This was first struck in 2018. It's been renewed several times. And I should also mention Cardinal Joseph Zen, the retired Bishop of Hong Kong, who is 93, will be traveling to Rome to attend Pope Francis's funeral. Apparently his passport was returned to him so he can make the journey. Earlier this week, he made headlines with a statement critical of the Vatican's decision to call those first general congregation meetings so quickly after Pope Francis's death. Father, it's another perplexing, policy, the China agreement. So I want your reaction to that.
Yes. Well, the Pope repeated a few times during the pontificate that he was ready and willing and wanting to go visit China. So I think a lot of what he did with China was motivated by that desire. It is, in me, one of the worst things of the pontificate, and I'm sad to say that. I think the Pope made a tremendous mistake. The Chinese Communist Party has effective control over the nomination of bishops. And so what that means is an atheistic government has tried to suppress Christianity wherever it is. They control who becomes Catholic bishops. They become state functionaries holding that position. Now, as you also mentioned, catechism is now being rewritten so that Chinese communist figures somehow have a role in the Christian faith. This is offensive. Children cannot be catechized. The dealings that Cardinal Zen had over the years with the communist government led him to understand on the ground what it's like to deal with communists. Yet he was not listened to when the Pope made these deals. So this deal has to be reversed. It is illegitimate, in my opinion, to give any secular power that is an atheistic communist regime any role in naming a Catholic bishop.
Yeah, Bob, we have to mention that the keeper of that secret China-Vatican agreement and one of the architects is the Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin. Now, he lost his job when everybody else did, but he's one of the leading contenders to succeed Pope Francis. How does this deal affect his candidacy?
Well, I don't think people can be can overestimate how big a problem it is that he was central to this. And the Holy Father said repeatedly that he was the person who was on top of all the details of the arrangement. So he was central to this disastrous arrangement with a communist regime that very clearly would like to either stamp out or absorb the church into itself. Now, another wild card in this, of course, is that Cardinal McCarrick was involved in those negotiations. He was sent by the Holy Father over there. He was still in somewhat of a good favor with the Vatican at that time. And I hope that eventually we will find out what kind of role he may have played in all of this. But I think ultimately, look, the authority for this goes back to the Holy Father. If he tells Parolin, I want a deal because we can't have this division between the church and the state forever, I guess he's going to have to carry it out. But to carry that out, I think carries with it some serious baggage as we go into the next conclave.
Father, we have to remember the Patchchamama Controversy that occurred in October of 2019. That was the Synod of Bishops on the Amazon. And this pagan idol was displayed in the Vatican Gardens as a precursor to the Synod. It was later taken from a church by a young Australian Catholic layman who was enraged by it and threw it in the Tiber, or Austrian rather. It was an act for which Pope Francis later asked forgiveness. Father, I want you to couple this because we're very tight on time. This Synod and the Patchchamama Controversy and the 2021 clampdown on the traditional Latin Mass, which the Pope did. He was particularly, a particular believer that the Latin Mass needed to go away. Your thoughts on all of that?
Sure. No, I think myself and other Catholic observers are stunned. you look at what the Pope did. He sat in the gardens while people from Latin America did a kind of ritualistic dance around a pagan idol statue. And then that statue was then brought into St. Peter's Basilica, allegedly under the inculturation motto, whereas that's not inculturation, that's paganism. Paganism, it has to be overcome. Thank God the Spanish missionaries were able to do that. So that was a mistake. Then you turn and say, wait a minute, the Mass that nourished the lives of saints, the traditional Latin Mass, is somehow harmful to the mission and the spiritual life of the Church, and we have to get rid of it. The Pope wrote in his document accompanying Traditionis Custodes that eventually everybody will have to leave the old Mass and come to the new Mass. Well, John Paul II and Benedict were of the opposite mind. They said if people are devoted to the worship over the centuries, doesn't the spirit of freedom of the sons of God teach us we should let them have that? So those mistakes, hopefully we're never going to see another Pachamama incident. Pagan rituals have no role in Christianity. We meant to stamp them out because they're leading people into sin and ignorance and blasphemy. And as regards the Latin Mass, if there's anything more necessary for the life of the Church, it's a greater reverence and worship. And the Latin Mass is what gives us that worship and reverence.
Bob, Pope Francis, we have to say it because it's true, with relentless intensity, he moved to stamp out the old Mass, drive it from parish life. Why did that Mass of the Ages, some call it the Mass of the Saints, which is attracting so many young people, why did it become a thing reviled and despised by Pope Francis and the people around him?
You know, I think that it's because it really asserts a strong sense of Catholic identity. At bottom, I think it's that. You can talk about, inheritance from Vatican II or people who have particular views about liturgy, but I think ultimately it boils down to that. And, if you look at Pachamama even in a larger context, it's kind of part of the same universalism that in a way Francis was pursuing. You remember that he signed this agreement with some Muslim leaders about God wills a plurality of religions. And that eventually had to be repudiated because, of course, this is precisely what is called universalism and indifferentism, that basically all religions are a path to God. And so Pachamama, even though she has a very dark history in Latin America prior to the arrival of the Spanish, that too can kind of be brought into the big tent. There's a reason why people don't feel an urgency of missionary work any longer, because if everybody is okay where they are, why should we go out to the missions? And I think that the fact that young people have been attracted so much to the Latin Mass may have contributed to this. By the way, we just had Easter and lots of young people came into the Catholic Church in France and England, here in the United States. I did not see one article that said that this was the Francis effect. I think that everywhere that people looked into this was because young people are feeling adrift. The world is bereft of authority and sure signs of what to do with your life, and they're looking for something more substantial. And of course, the Latin Mass is in part that.
Yeah, I've always been puzzled. I mean, I do think Pope Francis had he wanted to bring people who felt estranged and far away from the faith into the flock. I do think he and you see that when he went to the prisoners or when he went out even to the immigrants, or when he went to the poor. I can't understand why he couldn't turn a merciful eye to those in his own flock, those who wanted reverence and sacrality, and as Bob said, the kind of very vibrant and bold Catholic identity. That became the enemy, and I still can't figure out why, but maybe in the days ahead we can unpack that. Father, Bob, I want to get to this before we run out of time. We almost are. The synods became a real hallmark of Pope Francis's pontificate. This idea of bringing everybody to the table around small groups, and suddenly cardinals were not allowed into these synods. It was an invite-only event. He would bring in atheists and non-believers and young kids and people from other communities and nuns, and it was kind of a grab bag. But the fact is, there were a number of these, and it seems to be an effort to democratize the church, open it up, let others make the decisions. And in fact, just this week, here we see the beginning of the legacy, the German bishops issued a 4-page guide on how priests can bless couples in irregular unions, including same-sex relationships. But here's my question, Father. How will the synodal model carry into the next pontificate? Will it?
I hope it doesn't. I hope, in fact, that we return to what the Synod of Bishops really is, which is a meeting of bishops. You cannot have a Synod of Bishops in which other people, lay people, nuns, priests, deacons, that they have equal voting rights. Then it's no longer a synod. It's bishops meeting with other people, you can call it. The Synod on Synodality is an attempt to democratize the church, which is classical, sad to say, of modern political theory, where you undermine authority by saying, well, everyone has authority and we're all going to exercise it together. Meanwhile, who gets to pick the people who are present? Who gets to set up the discussion? Who gives the topics? Who tells you how to vote and when you can vote? No, the divine constitution of the church has to be reaffirmed. The bishops are collectively the successors of the apostles. Peter's successor is the Pope. They are the shepherds of the flock. The flock does not tell the shepherds what to do. The shepherds tell the flock what to do. And what the shepherds are supposed to say is what Christ taught them. So this is the issue here. If you want to take opinions on what people think are important, I think that's great. I love more information. What I don't want is somebody saying, well, Mrs. McGillicuddy over here, she has the same vote as Cardinal Muller at the next synod because her ideas about what church needs to do are important. She may have good ideas. She's not a shepherd of the church. So we got to get back. Yeah. This is sad to say. We have to reverse things in order to return to normalcy.
As long as you brought up Cardinal Gerhard Muller, he warns this week that the church could face schism if the next pope elected is in the same ideological line as Pope Francis. Bob, I'll let you react to that and the synodal model that we've been covering for so long.
Yeah, look, we can only speculate at this point because we don't know who the next man is who's going to be the successor of Peter. But I think we can say with some certainty that unless he's a very close follower of Pope Francis, synodality is going to fade away, and it may fade away rather quickly. In fact, I think that the Pope realized toward the end that it didn't seem to be going anywhere fast. That, we used to joke about the synodal process was about the process, that the synod is the process. And, what is it aiming at outside of itself other than to perpetuate the process? And that may be the reason why he put off those hot button issues until to June. There are these 10 special study groups that are supposed to report in June. Now they'll be reporting to a different pope. And he put off into 2028 this synodal assembly, which I think he must have known he would not be alive to see. So I think we'll know very quickly. If we do get someone who is a second Francis, maybe it'll linger on, but I can't see what great effect it's going to have in the future because it's had a very, very weak past.
Gentlemen, there's so much more we could say. We could go on for 2 hours about this pontificate, but we have the days ahead to do that. For now, we join the rest of the church praying for the repose of Pope Francis's soul and for the church and the cardinals during this interregnum period, a very important one. We will, of course, keep you up to date with all the happenings from Rome. You can follow my X account at Raymond Arroyo for more information. We will see you all next week, and you can find Robert Royal's incredible new book, Martyrs of the New Millennium, at bookstores, everywhere, online. Go and grab a copy. Our interregnum and conclave coverage will continue next week. And follow us on social media. We'll keep you up to date. Father, Bob, we will convene the Posse in Rome.